This is episode 61 of Our Modern Heritage, the new Home and Family Culture podcast. I'm your host, Jody Chafee. This is another solo episode to start out the new year. And with the new year, a lot of us are thinking about our resolutions and our goals for the year and putting a lot of really high expectations for the year. And so I want to talk a little bit about the stress and anxiety that can sometimes come from setting high expectations or having stress that are not necessarily related to those expectations, but stress in general, because life is all about stress. Distress or eustress, it's all stress. Some people are in more distress than others. Regardless of our level of stress, we all have our ways of coping with the stressors of our lives. But not all coping strategies are good. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of how we cope with life's struggles. I talked about it a bit with my conversation with Bonnie Simon of Maestro Classics in an earlier episode, that if we could turn to creativity rather than consumption to cope, the world would be such a different place. Over the course of the last decade, I've endured a lot of struggles. It started back in 2008 when Michael and I moved to Northern Virginia for school. Michael struggled to find employment while he got his graduate degree, and I was expecting our first baby. It all went downhill from there. At first, we thought the struggles would be temporary. Michael would finish his degree and find a good job. But then the recession happened. The student debt, postpartum stress, new parenthood, and underemployment, living in a very, very, very expensive part of the nation, took its toll on us. We were far from home with no family nearby, and we also felt abandoned by our community. Some of our coping strategies were productive, but most weren't. We became very good at eating out and watching a lot of our favorite TV shows. Those aren't terrible coping strategies, but they aren't so productive or constructive. The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines constructive coping as any instrumental approach to stress management that is generally considered to be adaptive or otherwise positive, and goes on to describe two kinds of constructive coping. Number one is problem-focused coping, a stress management strategy in which a person directly confronts a stressor in an attempt to decrease or eliminate it. Problem-focused coping is used primarily when a person appraises a stressor as within his or her capacity to change. Similar to active coping, this is about knowing our responsibility and capacity for conscientiously working on our situation to affect change. The second form of constructive coping is emotion-focused coping, in which a person focuses on regulating his or her negative emotional reactions to a stressor. Rather than taking actions to change the stressor itself, the individual tries to control feelings using a variety of cognitive and behavioral tools. This perspective is so important. Some conflicts are simply shaped by our perceptions. Some are just bad habits or beliefs about a situation. We don't always need to change a situation, and some things are just outside of our control. I'm currently in the process of creating a course outlining what real coping looks like and challenging our ideas around coping. The coping strategies I will be suggesting in the course are different from defense mechanisms or escape mechanisms, defined as an unconscious reaction pattern employed by the ego to protect itself from the anxiety that arises from psychic conflict. While some of the strategies I suggest may be a form of channeling emotional energy, I want to suggest ways to avoid escaping or denying the stressor altogether. In my experience, denial and escape can only gratify for a moment and might even create more problems while the initial conflict continues to go unsolved. I want to help more people realize that when we remain conscious to our reaction patterns, then we have more power over our situations than we might think. I also want to give more people more tools than simply passive coping. This involves wishful thinking, and I talked about this in a blog post back in May of 2018, and I include a link to that blog post in the show notes for this episode. When we give in to this idea that we simply cannot change our situation, then we give up. We give up our capacity to change anything and leave it up to external forces, chance, or hope. Now, hope is not a bad thing in its proper form, but hope plus action equals faith, and faith requires action. For example, when you want a garden, you don't just sit and hope you can have a garden. You plant seeds, you nourish the soil, and give it sunlight. These actions are based on faith that the garden will grow. Family culture, as I've described a lot in the past, is like a garden. You have a vision of what the garden will look like, what you want to grow, and you cultivate good soil. You plant seeds and pull out weeds. Good coping strategies are like pulling out weeds and putting in fertilizer. You hold on to that vision that keeps you grounded to why you are doing all of this. That's the foundation of hope. Hope is your why for doing what you do. Hope is the reason for resilience and the ability to cope, but is only the beginning. Coping is all about recovery. Recovery is the ability to bounce back after an encounter with a stressor. The duration of the recovery will depend on the stressor, the impact or intensity, or the amount of trauma you experience. The better you are at coping with an encounter, the quicker and easier your recovery will be. Or might be. No promises. Still, there are some things in life that cannot be anticipated, no matter how much you think you have studied or prepared. That's when more long-term coping strategies are needed. In my course, I discuss more of the care and patience that goes into perhaps a lifetime of coping. Sometimes I feel like Michael and I have endured a lifetime of coping after 10 years of depression and anxiety. 10 years is a long time to endure when I used to believe that life's challenges always have a solution. I was not prepared to cope with this trial. But I want you to know about the things that I have learned over the course of these experiences. I've studied and prayed so often about what I can do to impact the course of my life and my family. Life is full of so many ups and downs. As parents, we are thrust into parenthood during the most vulnerable times of our lives. We are dealing with becoming adults and learning about ourselves. We're learning about our relationship and figuring out marriage. We are barely figuring out our careers and finances, among so many other things. And maybe some of you have those things figured out, but it still doesn't always prepare us for parenthood. I don't know that anything can prepare us for parenthood. And then we bring these kids into our lives when our hormones are going crazy and we're naive and we just want to figure all of this out. There's no way to ever be fully prepared. And all of that and all the things that are thrown at us during parenthood as new parents. And as our children grow and change, there's new problems that we can't even anticipate. But with everything else going on and all the baggage we bring with us, sometimes our kids get caught in the crossfire of our poor abilities to cope with all of this. Even if we sometimes feel like they're the problem. But if we step back and evaluate the situation and allow ourselves to cope constructively, then we realize we're all just working through life together. But so often, we go between stressor and escaping, stressor, consolation. We try to cope by consoling ourselves from the stressor rather than being proactive. So we go from stress to escape, to consolation with our addictions of media, food, or other more destructive forms of consolation. And so what I want to work on is how to end this cycle of going between stress and consolation and get into real coping. Coping for me has come to mean three main things. Number one, coping is about being constructive. When we choose to produce rather than consume as a coping mechanism, we will truly appreciate our ability to cope, to truly cope, and not just console ourselves with our addictions or escape for a moment, only to return to the problem more frazzled and with more problems our escape created for us. We choose to do something constructive with the stress. We can play an instrument. We can get outside and go for a walk. We can meditate, or we can face the problem head on. During my 30 days of coping challenge back in August of 2018, one of the people who participated in the challenge told me about how she caught herself trying to console herself from the stress and consoling her daughter. Her daughter broke her arm. And while she was at the hospital getting her arm set and everything like that, she came home with a cast and she had prepared some cookies or a treat or something for her daughter. And then it dawned on her that she was trying to console the situation with food. And so that's not necessarily very constructive. It's just consoling the problem. And so instead of just trying to console her daughter with the treats, she sat her down to talk to her about what had happened and talk to her about her situation and her experience and everything like that. And that was more of a relief, more strength to her daughter than if she just consoled her with the treats. They still ate the treats, but it wasn't the primary source of the coping strategy. I hope that makes sense. So 2, coping has come to mean balance and recovery. It's about resilience, and resilience is the ability to spring back. Coping and recovery are about the ability to spring back and recover. Some things will take longer to recover from, like I mentioned, depending on the level of trauma we experience. When we are clear about our boundaries, we can learn how to create space to nourish ourselves, and we can nourish ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and socially. In the book, The Power of Full Engagement by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz, I learned that each of these areas of our recovery are important for balancing our energy to cope with the ebb and flow of stress in each of these areas. And they talk about how we often get too much stress mentally and emotionally, and not enough stress physically and spiritually. So we need to be able to recharge our minds and hearts more, and we need to push ourselves to move our bodies and spirits more. And 3, coping has become to me to mean self-care. I know that that's a big, trendy, cliche word, but some things will never be resolved. Some things are just part of life. We find balance when we take the time to do the things that establish boundaries and nourish our bodies, minds, and spirits. We can develop a talent or a skill. We can devote ourselves to a cause, perform a service for someone who cannot do that thing for themselves. We can get a coach or a mentor or a therapist. We can do those things that will meet our own needs. Find that balance I talked about in 2, and learn to say no to things that stress you out. Basically, life is meant to be endured, sure, but endurance doesn't have to mean pushing through and allowing life to crush us. In an article called Resilience is about how you recharge, not how you endure, Sean Aker and Michelle Gillen help us understand what resilience is really about. They say, we often take a militaristic, tough approach to resilience and grit. We imagine a Marine slogging through the mud, a boxer going one more round, or a football player picking himself up off the turf for one more play. We believe that the longer we tough it out, the tougher we are, and therefore the more successful we will be. However, this entire concept is scientifically inaccurate. The very lack of a recovery period is dramatically holding back our collective ability to be resilient and successful. Research has found that there is a direct correlation between a lack of recovery and increased incidence of health and safety problems. And lack of recovery, whether by disrupting sleep with thoughts of work or having continuous cognitive arousal by watching our phones, is costing our companies $62 billion a year. That's billion, not million, lost productivity, end quote. The idea that we are supposed to just endure, slog through, react, escape, or toughen up is making us more stressed, more sick, and more depressed. When I think of coping, I want to think about being proactive, productive, and in control. I'm trying to catch myself feeling stress or anxiety and fall into a habit of using a constructive coping strategy. For example, think about waiting in a long line for something necessary or feeling rushed at a red light. Instead of getting impatient, I can read a book on my phone, or I can listen to a book or podcast in the car. I can look around at all the people surrounding me, maybe talk to them or imagine where they're going. I can sing in my car too. There are lots of ways that we can cope with that stress of waiting. And it doesn't necessarily mean something as trivial as waiting in line or waiting at a red light. Often we have to wait for things. And we can meditate, we can socialize, we can be constructive. If it's a long-term stressor, I would rather work towards something unrelated to the issue than focus on the problem I cannot solve. Or I could become proactive at figuring out how I can recover daily and perhaps finding some solution that I wouldn't have expected. Don't just endure. Be proactive, but also take time to care for ourselves. Take the time to recover. Get a good night's sleep. Allow yourself a good cry. There are so many ways to recover. Get exercise. Go outside and get interaction with nature. In my course, I will be talking about all the different strategies that will allow us to recover, to nourish our minds, our bodies, our hearts, and our spirits, and in ways that allow us to create healthy habits and constructive coping strategies in our toolboxes. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your feedback and just appreciate you following along with my journey of creating this podcast and my journey of learning about coping and being resilient and developing my family culture. I think that it's super important to adopt this principle of resilience and coping in our family culture, because I think that so often we allow the stress of our lives to impact our family culture, to tear down our families, to break apart our families. But when we allow ourselves the ability to cope, to take care of ourselves, to be able to recover, to be able to be proactive and constructive, all of these things help us to be healthier and stronger, more productive, and just all around feeling better, feeling good. And then our relationships can thrive because we're able to cope better. So thank you so much for listening. I love getting your feedback. You can like, rate, and share on your favorite podcasting medium or social media platform. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook and Pinterest at Family Culture Podcast, and on Twitter at _Family Culture. Come check out my show notes and resources at homeandfamilyculture.com. In each episode show notes, I recommend books that I've read or that have been recommended to me that are based on the topic that I cover. And so in each show notes, there's really good book recommendations, either books that I've read or the guests that I interview, the books that they recommend, and they go into more detail about the topic that we discuss. So go check it out. Thank you again for listening. Mother Teresa once said, "If you want to change the world, go home and love your family."